Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to the second panel of the day. We will have populism, frozen conflicts, and the emerging Balkans. I think that's an attractive cocktail of topics. And I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers. First of all, we're going to have Lyndon Allen. I think he's the perfect person to bring us up to speed on Transnistria, which, as you know, is that disputed territory that has been caught between Russia and Moldova since the end of the Soviet Union. Lyndon is currently a risk assessment specialist at the law firm Baker & McKenzie, but before that, he spent extensive time on the ground in Moldova, and he has a diverse career that spans research, diplomacy, and peace building, and all those things with the post-Soviet space as a constant. So I think he will give us a long-term and up-to-date perspective on Transnistria. Our second speaker is Dr. Paula Ganga. I'm pleased to say that I first met Paula when she joined our CERES MA. We won't count what year that was, who can remember these things, but it's really been a pleasure for me to watch her develop this very powerful specialization in political economy and comparative politics, and to go on and complete her dissertation in the government department at Georgetown. I have no doubt that we're soon going to be seeing the publication of her first work, which looks at the political determinants behind governments changing policies on privatization and nationalization in our region of the world. And currently, she's branching out to look at populism in Eastern Europe. We all know this is a tremendously complicated situation, complicated phenomenon, and I think we're going to be quite fortunate to have this political economy perspective on populism. Last but not least, we have Eric Rubin, who comes to us with a distinguished diplomatic career that's taken him to my favorite city, Moscow, but most recently to Sofia, Bulgaria, where he served as American ambassador. And I think Bulgaria is one of those understudied states that deserves a lot more attention. In my class on post-socialist cities, we actually take a deep dive into property issues in Sofia, and I've learned a lot from studying Bulgaria and its position as a post-communist state, but one that also has entered the EU. So this afternoon, Ambassador Rubin is going to brief us on Sofia and its relations with these important international partners, and also hopefully say a little bit about the domestic challenges that Bulgaria is facing today. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Lyndon, our first presenter.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm actually going to talk about more generally about frozen conflicts, including Transnistria. So you're going to get, I don't know if it's now 5 or 6, however you count them for the price of 1. Here's the basic map. This map doesn't include Karabakh, which is often, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is often excluded from discussions about protracted conflicts in the Eurasia space because it doesn't have as clearly defined a Russia component as some of the other places do. But it's also, nevertheless, a place that has some of the same phenomena. So, first I want to say thank you to everybody at CERES and otherwise in my path of Russian studies that allowed me to get into some places that I really never went to school for a few years ago. And I wanted to, though, offer this to say, why am I here talking to you today about this? And then I got a Facebook reminder telling me that 10 years ago, exactly, I was flying back to London to practice law, unrelated to the panel presentation I had given the previous day at AAA on frozen conflicts. So I've been working on these places for a while. They are endlessly interesting. Many thanks to Angela for inviting me, and thanks to all the generations of CERES professors. I see Harley and Margie are here, which is wonderful. I know Professor Gustafson is here, and it was in his class, actually, that I dug into General Lebed and his adventures in Transnistria, which, of course, were some of the origin stories of one of these places. Ambassador Bill Hill is not here, but he was also played a big role in me eventually going out to work in Moldova. And unrelatedly, and she's not here, but Edna Andrews, the head of the Duke Russian department, is somebody else I should thank. It's her birthday today. So happy birthday, Edna, and thank you. And of course, last but not least, my mom is here today. Thanks, Mom. Because this crazy, crazy adventure that I'm going to tell you a little bit about all began kind of a long time ago when I was 8 years old and my parents moved to Leningrad so that my dad could serve at the U.S. consulate there, which of course has now been closed, unfortunately. And I went to a Soviet school. So I was explaining to somebody, to make it short, last week that I got the Russia chip put in when I was a kid, so that's it. I don't think I am operational in other regions. Anyway, anyway, this was the birth moment, we might say, of the two newest. I would not call them frozen conflict regions, but protracted conflict is probably an appropriate term. The regions in Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine, which are not currently controlled by the constitutional authorities of that country. Let's move on. Oops, sorry. Yeah. So I want to talk first about what are frozen conflict areas, and I put frozen conflicts in quotation marks because some people would use the term protracted conflicts, breakaways, separatist regions. Each of those terms has its own valence, but I'll use the term that's in the program. They are not entirely any of the things that you see here. They're not entirely places where Russia can push a button and things happen. They are not black holes of smuggling and endless illicit arms production, although those things also happen in some of these territories. I don't find the terms occupied or liberated, unless we're writing position papers or working for a government or in a diplomatic function, to be particularly useful in describing these places. They are, of course, strictly speaking, fragments of the USSR, just like all the post-Soviet countries, but I don't find that to be a particularly useful frame for viewing them either. Low-hanging fruit is something that people often use to describe Transnistria, the easiest, supposedly, of the protracted conflicts to solve. I reminded my good friend about that, who yesterday became Moldova's deputy prime minister for reintegration, and I wished him luck, because anybody who has that job certainly will need luck. And I owe a debt of thanks to Gerald Toll for this sort of framing concept. We did a talk together recently, and he sort of opened my eyes to some of the ways that people think about these places. So what are they then? What they are, each of them is really slightly different in terms of its origin story, right? There's the old Tolstoy line that people who work on a lot of these conflicts will often use, which is, all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And that's an easy way to describe the simple fact that these places came about in different ways. For example, the peacekeeping operations that are headed by Russia, we wouldn't necessarily call them that in either of these places today. In Transnistria and Abkhazia, both started around the same time, but they have completely different origin stories. So one in Transnistria was the remnant of the 14th Army, and was initially called, and may still be called for all I know, the CIS-PKF in Abkhazia. That actually came about as a result of a deal, or an implicit deal, where the US wanted to have a PKO of a certain format in Haiti, and the Russians wished to have a PKO of a format that they would run in Abkhazia. And I was just looking through some cables that I FOIA requested on this topic, and I almost said quid pro quo, but the diplomatic bargain was actually outlined very explicitly and clearly by Madeleine Albright during her time as US UN. So it's interesting to think back on the origin stories. For local residents, and this is actually going to be a thread that runs through my presentation because these are the last people, unfortunately, that are often talked about in rooms like this when we talk about these regions. People who live there, it's just the place they live. Right? It's often the place they were born. Now, in some cases, they might have moved there from somewhere else in Russia or the former Soviet space, but it's a place where these are places where people live, and it's important not to forget that. It's a little bit of a blurry picture, but you can see the opening of the Tiraspol City Christmas tree in 2011 there at left. The mayor, unfortunately, was found murdered in a criminal razborka in a garage in Odessa this summer. So that's sort of the dark and light sides of life in some of these places. They are able to appear to the people who live there to be functioning state-like entities. And here's where Transnistria is a particularly interesting case study. Things work there. They have elections with unexpected results. People vote. People speak out and are not necessarily put in jail. And although there are some Moldovan friends of mine in attendance today, and so I apologize for saying this, but for the Transnistrians looking across the river at Moldova and the completely dysfunctional political system that has emerged there in the last few years, they actually can credibly say, hey, we think what we have works better than what they have, and why would we want to join a place that had, in one recent year, 5 different governments and a pretty strong reputation for kleptocratic rule and politicians who don't necessarily even have honor among thieves. So, important to realize that these places are not somehow, trash canistans or completely godforsaken places. For local and Russian elites, and I include in that elites in the sovereigns, in particular in Ukraine and Moldova, these are places where there's a lot of money to be made. Smuggling, workarounds, areas with no laws or with laws that can be, easily changed or purchased. Those are opportunities for some people. Sources of fame, again, General Lebed. There's the statue that was opened in his honor in Bender in 2014. And some of the assistance programs that are deployed to these places by the Russians also provide an opportunity for skimming or double dipping, which has been documented in the case of Mr. Rogozin and some of the programs that were very nicely rolled out, at least with fairly good production values. You'll see, actually, of course you can't see it because the screen is a bit dim, but the school that was opened there on that slide is it's a Moldovan Cyrillic script school, so that's a separate discussion, but an interesting part of the Transnistria phenomenon. And it has a little plaque that says, this is a present from VV Putin. So it's personal. Let's see. One more thing about this slide that I wanted to mention on the right. You'll see the Russian flag is flying at this Ribnitsa State Administration building. That actually is something that I just noticed on my most recent trip there, and I'm not sure that they've been doing that for a long time. It sort of echoes the way the Moldovans fly the EU flag at a lot of their state institution buildings. So, folks learn and adapt and up their soft power game, even as, we have some of the problems that were discussed on the previous panel. So these are also places where the culture war civilizational battle, I think that was mentioned by Valerie in the last panel, play out. Here you have a local house of culture outfitted for the Day of Family, which has become a big celebration. The local grocery stores give out magnets. World War II memorials, generally pretty well maintained, fresh flowers, people taking their kids to see them. So this is actually a way in which Transnistria, which was generally not considered to be an ethnic conflict at the beginning, has taken on more of a component with a deep personalized cleavage now, and except it's not necessarily your ethnicity, but which historical narrative do you accept. And actually in Moldova, it's even more complicated by the fact that there's plenty of people on right bank Moldova, or in what some would say of Moldova proper, who also embrace the kind of Russian World War II narrative of the 20th century. For Russia, these places give kind of a semblance of bringing back the empire. So this is a bridge, this is a little bridge by the beach in Tiraspol, which flashes in Russian flag lights. It also has a mode where it flashes in Transnistrian flag lights. And on the right is a little billboard that tells the history of a village in Transnistria called Mayak, which is home to one of the Soviet Union's 14 large jamming stations. This is a facility that continues to operate and that the Russians purchased from the Transnistrians in 2007. So there is certain continuities which are, I think, important to note. But at the same time, it's not You can't just say these are remnants of the Soviet Union. There's more there. One of the things, a couple of the things in Transnistria which remain as part of the Soviet legacy are several large industrial assets. In addition to the antenna complex, there's one of the most modern steelworks in the Soviet Union is in Ribnica, which employs a considerable amount of people and still functions, and a huge power plant in the south of the country, in the south of the region, which generates enough electricity that it can power all of Moldova, parts of Ukraine, and has even exported electricity to Romania. It was really meant to be a regional facility, and that's actually the place where Russia gives Transnistria the biggest subsidy, because it allows that plant to operate on free natural gas. So the gas is fired, the plant produces electricity, funds come to Transnistria, and eventually they make their way to the holes in the region's budget, which are not covered by other collections, and the revenues do not make their way back to Gazprom. Sorry, it's a little warm here, so I'm gonna unjack it, if you don't mind. So, again, strong Soviet legacy, but with elements of globalization. So you see the Transnistrian sausage producer is advertising in the upper corner photo, молочная sausage, and the tagline is "Ценности есть." We have values. So now it is humorous to everybody, even to former Soviet people. But in DC, it's humorous. But in reality, there is a great nostalgia for these products, their stable prices, etc. Let's see. Here some illustrations of electoral politics in these places. So on the left is a repurposed billboard that was being used as a tarp near the New Athos Monastery in Abkhazia. It's a poster for the Russian Duma elections, in which many of the Abkhaz who were made Russian citizens were able to vote. And it says, "Together with Russia" at the bottom. But in fact, the population of Abkhazia has at least 2 occasions not voted the way that Moscow wanted them to in local elections. And this was true even after Russia deployed its most potent soft power tools, such as concerts from Joseph Kobzon, and not to mention the other. These are serious deployments. On the right, we see a campaign poster for Anatoly Kaminsky in the 2011 Transnistrian so-called presidential race, which verifies that he is supported by Russia, but he lost. And so did Mr. Smirnov, who had run the region since its inception. So these are places where people are trying to survive, and sometimes they get creative. You can't read it, but I'll read it a little bit for you. On the left of the billboard is a Transnistrian local bank advertising that it's been audited by Ernst & Young. How about that? Transnistrian banks have a hard time getting integrated with the international financial system, so well done. And on the right is a sign advertising the local jobs office, which says quite simply, "Do not leave, there are jobs. Не уезжайте, есть рабочие места," which I think is just great direct advertising. Again, it's the economy stupid. It's important to remember, it's a common theme in American politics, but it's true everywhere. The recently released intercepts of some of the Donbass guys by the Dutch, I guess yesterday, they just came out, had this one great line, which is when Borodai, who was running the Donetsk entity for a while, was speaking with Surkov, and he said, "The biggest problem I have is that the money is running out. У меня заканчиваются бабки." And this is a perpetual problem for these places, because if you steal some of it, it does run out. And even if you don't, it does. But in the 90s, Transnistria also would frequently appeal for Russian assistance, and they were sometimes referred to, the acronym in Russian is PMR. Sometimes that was jokingly made into Papina и моя республика, Daddy and My's Republic, for Mr. Smirnov and his son. And sometimes it was made into Помоги мне, Россия, Help me, Russia. But these are, again, humorous but real serious themes. Let's see. So how do we manage these entities? And my mother, who's always been my best editor, asked when she looked at these slides, what do you mean by we? What I mean is the international community, generally speaking, not the West or Russia or any particular part, but just generally speaking, the post-Soviet conflicts. And I would say that if you look at the formats, which I don't have time to go into, fortunately, they're a little bit not fit for purpose nowadays, and they're kind of clunky. They don't take into account the tremendous influence of financial flows, kleptocracy in the region, and it's just very hard for old school diplomats in suits in a very formalized negotiation process to address those topics. I mean, that's not what I mean, but you know what I mean. And I would also point out the very complex Transnistrian peacekeeping setup, which this shows only peacekeeping posts. There's another map that I have which shows even more posts for non-peacekeeping folks, which include many Transnistrian so-called security services, which really, if there is to be a solution to that particular conflict, jobs will have to be found for all the guys who carry guns and make a locally very competitive wage. So important to think about that also. So a little bit about the best practice of separatism, if you will. On the left is a gentleman sitting across from me who was at the time the vice rector of Tiraspol, in parentheses for my Moldovan friends, State University, but just Tiraspol University, we can call it. And on the right, he is in his new function as the Deputy Minister of Science and Sport for the Donetsk People's Republic. So there were other more high-profile people who moved from Transnistria to Donbass, but I found this one to be particularly interesting because he was not particularly high-profile, and it just shows that there are people who work on these places as, for long periods of time, and they know what they're doing. We, on the other hand, usually have an ad hoc, reactive approach to these places. This actually fits very nicely with David's presentation. These are all, this is actually a slide that I put together in 2008. I'm not afraid to admit that because what is interesting about it now is it shows that Russia was, in a way, beta testing or using as a sandbox some of these regions for some of the technologies that it's using now. These are actually much less sophisticated than social media. The Tiraspol Times was simply a fake newspaper online in English designed to tell people about things like the Transnistrian Riviera. I'm not joking. And the fake conference of Western academics that Ed Lucas many years ago sort of what's the English for разоблачил, revealed to have taken place is also on this, and that was, again, I think of a piece with some of the operations we see being done to this day. Again, informational cover. So this is real news, but you can't see the bottom. This slide is pulled from a presentation that the Transnistrian so-called Ministry of Foreign Affairs presented at talks in 2014. And they were basically trying to highlight the point that, hey, Moldova's put us in a blockade again. And we can prove that's true because Vladimir Putin said so in a phone call with the President of the United States. So that's valuable support, and it doesn't really cost Russia that much. Russia really is able to offer things in addition to the kind of notional whatever soft power, although I know some people in DC don't think Russia has soft power, but I think many people in that part of the world would beg to differ. They also offer concrete benefits. So on the top is a shot that I took of Donetsk local TV in June of 2014, which is offering scholarships to local students to attend Russian universities. Very, very quick into the conflict. That was being, by the way, the little running line on the bottom is a warning being put out that everybody in Bezler's gang will be destroyed. So watching that TV was dissonant and frightening, but I did it for a day. I suffer for you. Anyway, on the bottom, you see a little comparison published by the Transnistrian news agency showing that their pensions are second only to Russia's. In comparison with Moldova and Ukraine. So remember, it's all relative, folks. And when your sovereign is the poorest country in Europe, or one of the two, it's not hard to think that maybe you have it okay. So we have it better here, right? These are tables which compare the costs for utilities and for basic food products, which again, the Transnistrian, I think it's a de facto state-run entity, news agency, they put these out regularly, and you know, I'm sure some people find them useful, or at least reassuring about their life choices, perhaps. They offer, the Russians are able to offer folks who live in these places passports, and that's something that I did a lot of research into, but won't go into much today. They offer various assistance programs, this fancy new trolley bus that says, "Into the future together with Russia." Energy security, as I mentioned, the gas, but of course the trunk line that goes through Tiraspol is going to be potentially phased out with the new lines that are going to be coming online. So that's going to be interesting, a very interesting change factor to watch. So what is the West strategy? And I think the answer that I find when I ask that question is that we don't really have one. In the past, we tried to apply some kind of a mix of international law and moral principles, but that was always applied unevenly, and we don't have even that coherent of an approach today. Meanwhile, Russia has, people like Mr. Antufeyev, who has, been in Transnistria for 20 years and was at the beginning of Donbass, and I don't believe he's there anymore. What's going to happen next? What's new? Here we see, just yesterday, a delegation of Chinese investors visiting Abkhazia and talking about some very attractive, modern, innovative projects. Interesting. The son of Russian prosecutor Yuri Chaika has been in talks, and I think he may actually have started a Bitcoin mining operation in Transnistria using some of that free electricity. So not a month after I had been thinking, how do you monetize free gas, right? Folks are creative, sometimes more creative than we are. Also very creative financial wizardry with this international settlement bank that handles financial transfers between Donbass and Russia and is based in South Ossetia. So it allows people to keep their hands clean sanctions-wise, and in some other ways, it allows some favored people to skim a lot of money. So in that way, it's consistent with many of Russia's policies in these places. So Russia offers benefits of some kind, even if they're not a major league player or whatever we may say. China potentially offers investment without question about politics, recognition, or all those other things. What is it that the West is able to offer to people who live in these places and to their elites? There could be grand bargains, perhaps. Maybe everybody wants to see Presidents Trump and Putin win the Nobel Peace Prize for resolving some of these conflicts. There could be big projects at the end of these, and I would encourage you, and I'll close with this, sorry. Imagine what Donbass really needed before the war, and needs even more now, is reconstruction and environmental remediation after being after being the site of some not very sustainable mining operations for about 70 years. So create a fund, make it the equivalent of a Superfund site. Guess what? Then everybody has jobs there, and maybe that's a ticket. A private equity type fund entity to invest in some of the Transnistrian enterprises, which still do function, but at the moment have been privatized in kind of a questionable way. So we need to be creative, and the solutions are not necessarily going to come from traditional security and diplomacy track one type mechanisms. I think that's it. Thanks very much.
Is it? Oh, okay, better. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really grateful and excited to be here. CERES was actually my very first home in the US, and it's really great to see here not just professors, colleagues, dissertation advisors, classmates, but also all these people who are really interested in this region of the world that all of us love and want to know more about. Today, I get a pleasant task of talking about the most successful part of the post-communist and post-Soviet region. And yet, even there, we see a lot of challenges. Eastern Europe is now part of NATO, part of the EU, has gone through a really exciting economic and political transition throughout these past 30 years now. But even with that, the region is going through many, many challenges. And here I would like to echo President Kwasniewski when in his remarks he said that, well, especially if we focus on populism and look at some of the evolution that took place in Eastern Europe, what we're actually seeing is just a consequence of living in the 21st century. He was talking about globalization, migration, new technologies, economic crisis, and the crisis of traditional democracy. And each one of these can be seen as a cause for what we currently see, not just in Eastern Europe, but throughout the world. Specifically on populism, each one of these previously mentioned factors can explain populism and the way democracy has been evolving in the US, Latin America, Asia, as well as Western and Eastern Europe. So in a way, Eastern Europe has integrated so well within the world that it's suffering from the exact same afflictions that the rest of the world is. Just to touch upon some of the factors that have led us here. So each one of these processes that can explain the current trend in populism in Eastern Europe has had both positive and negative impacts. So globalization has integrated these economies within the global economic system. It meant growth, it meant new products on these markets, as well as access to international markets, but it has also meant tremendous economic dislocation, loss of jobs, a lot of domestic economic challenges. And this is true for Eastern Europe as well as the rest of the world. The same with migration. While in some instances, even the specter of migration led to some of these populist political leaders to come to power, and President Kwasniewski was giving the example of Poland, actually in Eastern Europe, the reverse trend of migration, when a lot of the highly educated, hardworking people of these countries ended up migrating towards Western Europe and other parts of the developed world, resulted in what me and my co-authors call in one of our papers a political brain drain. These could have been the leaders that could have, in time, started parties or joined parties, supported democratic politics, and so on. But a lot of the countries have suffered from the fact that a lot of their peoples have left, and then the specter of possibly newcomers affecting the national integrity of these countries resulted in populist leaders gaining substantial more support in the votes than they would have otherwise. We've already seen in the previous panel the role of new technologies. This is true in Eastern Europe as well. And when it comes to the crisis of traditional democracy, Eastern Europe has a very interesting evolution because, you know, it's been 30 years since the fall of communism. In those very short 30 years, Eastern Europe has had to experience both the development of a democratic way of running politics, as well as the rise of populism, and maybe now it's challenged by other political parties. So what we see now in Western Europe happened over the post-war period. In Eastern Europe, it had to happen in 30 years. So we see a concentration of this political and economic evolution in only 30 years in Eastern Europe. The region had to both globalize very quickly as well as respond to the challenge of having weaker party institutions, as well as a less consolidated democratic system. So good things, but also very unstable things still within the region. Yes, these countries have joined the EU and NATO, but as some of the victories in the region for populist leaders have shown, things were still quite in flux. This exacerbated speed of transition has meant that, as I mentioned, a lot of people in the region felt left behind. They felt as if they were the losers in the entire process, which has opened the has paved the way for these political entrepreneurs, populist leaders, to step in and gain substantial power. Just to define a little bit populism, political science loves definitions, so the most used definition right now in political science for populism is that it's a thin-centered ideology which divides society within two antagonistic groups. On the one hand, you have the corrupt elite, and on the other hand, you have the pure people. And yes, and the populist leaders claim that they are here to represent those pure and sometimes poor people and represent their interests. It's thin-centered because oftentimes we see populists on the right and on the left, more inclusive, which we usually see in Latin America, as well as more exclusive, which we see in Western Europe with a more nationalistic bent. But this the division of society between the elite and the people leads us to some of the consequences we see once populists actually come and run governments. What do we see? On the one hand, because they come to power claiming to represent the people, you see a strong consolidation of political power. Valerie, Professor Sperling was mentioning earlier, in the case of Russia, with the two goals of the elite being to stay in power and to stay out of jail, we actually see the same thing for populist leaders. Once they come to power with this mantle of we represent the people, you see them seeking to consolidate executive power, because at the end of the day, as governments or heads of states of these countries, having been elected by the people, however they define those people, you see them reaching out and trying to dismantle some of the separation of power that has come with the process of democratization in this region. So you end up seeing a lot of political consolidation. This has a huge impact on the way the other branches that usually act as checks and balances on executive power, and ending up either sidelined or being co-opted within the regime. So throughout Eastern Europe, when populist leaders have come to power, we have seen either a decreased role of the judiciary or a replacement of former members or of members of the judiciary that weren't appointed by the current regime, oftentimes leading to quite large political scandals because of these changes. The same thing happened with media. Once these political parties come to power, we've seen this in Poland as well as in Hungary, we end up seeing the state, now representing the populist government, taking over many of the outlets, media outlets, and with the rise of new technologies, making it easier for some of the populist rhetoric to pervade the media landscape. This is on the political side. There's also a set of wide-ranging economic consequences to the rise in power of populist leaders. What this has meant has been an increase in corruption. The region has always struggled with the fact that the communist legacy has meant quite extensive black or gray markets, which the process of accession to the EU has meant trying to reduce this kind of corruption. However, with this kind of legacy, it was quite easy once populist leaders came to power for this kind of corruption to return if it had disappeared at any point, which is quite doubtful. I'm from Romania, and it was always easy to see corruption at any level of official or private interactions in society. Well, this has also meant that by increasing this kind of corruption, the regime itself created a critical mass of political and mostly economic elites that are now indebted to the people who have benefited them politically and economically. And this is true both in terms of economic elites. A very interesting case study is of Hungary. Magyar Balint has actually written extensively on what he calls the post-communist mafia state, where he traces the group of acolytes around Viktor Orban and how each of them has managed to secure their position thanks to the economic power bestowed by Orban being prime minister for so long and having such a great and extensive hold on power. But there's also been, in terms of those which I mentioned felt like the losers from the process of globalization, those who felt like losers, seeing themselves as the center of the policy agenda of these political populist leaders. When both in Hungary, Poland, as well as in Czech Republic, when these populist leaders came to power, they did make strong appeals to these losers of globalization, and oftentimes the promises were some of them were of economic nature, and especially my fieldwork in Hungary has shown that once Orban got into office, he actually fulfilled some of these economic promises, and people themselves felt like they were being listened to by the political elite. In comparison to previous elites who they perceived as just, following EU regulations and following the prescribed recipes imposed by Western actors, EU or international. So in a way, these victories of populist leaders have resulted in a deep change of both the political and the economic landscape within these countries. It means that there's a lot of people invested in these political regimes surviving. The fact that the post-communist mafia state around Viktor Orban depends on him staying in power and on Fidesz holding on to power. It means that in subsequent elections, it might be more difficult for the opposition or other political forces to truly emerge. And this actually relates to the second goal of political leaders, which is to stay out of jail. So for these political and economic elites not to go to jail because of the corruption that took place during, say, the Orban years, it means that in some way or form, the party needs to continue staying in power. So these are some of the consequences of electing populist leaders. What can we do? What can be some of the solutions? So there is some optimism. Recent elections across Eastern Europe have shown that in some of them the opposition truly can mobilize. For example, in Hungary, one of the examples I gave earlier, now the city of Budapest is no longer controlled by the Fidesz party, and therefore there are ways in which even in countries where opposition parties, which is the case for Hungary, were not very strong, an opposition can form and can fight. Similarly, in Poland, there have been some changes, and President Kwasniewski was mentioning that now Kaczynski can no longer, he can rule, but he cannot rule so easily as he did before. The problem, though, in some of the recent positive trends is that, in fact, there is a deep divide. Some of the victories we've seen against populist leaders mostly come from urban areas. So Budapest is no longer controlled by populists, but a lot of recent reports have shown that the rural areas are significantly under this kind of populist control once populists gain power. As an example, a recent very extensive report by the New York Times showed how these populist leaders actually used EU funds that they you know, they always rail against the EU. They use those funds to shore up their fiefdoms within the rural areas of these countries. And because of the migration I mentioned earlier, a lot of these rural areas are not economically thriving. So therefore, voting for the populist leaders seems to be the only way to keep some of the benefits that you are now receiving, or just keep out of trouble, because some of the examples presented in that New York Times report were quite frightening and quite similar to some of the tactics you would see not in a democratic state, but in a quite authoritarian one. So while there is this positive aspect of elections are still happening, and as long as they're contested, populist leaders can be overthrown or just replaced, there are some areas of the countries that of these countries that can and will stay under this kind of control. To conclude, as long as there's still a significant opposition within these countries, there's still hope. However, there needs to be a little bit more of a role from the EU. One of the positive aspects of being an EU member means that EU institutions can exert some sort of control when they disperse these kinds of funds to populist leaders. However, what had emerged from recent accounts of, especially the agricultural funds, was that in its attempts to deal with its own internal dysfunctions, the EU just gives out the money, hoping that somehow that will placate some of these regions, instead of truly trying to engage with some of the developments that are happening in Eastern Europe. However, hopefully that will not continue for too long, considering some of the challenges that these populist leaders have been bringing to the existence of the EU. So, the hope would be that more opposition parties will be able to emerge and try to retake the primary spot within the elections of these countries. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm a teaching alumnus of CERES, and I'm here with my colleague Sean Dorman, who's the editor of our Foreign Service Journal, and she is a true alumna of CERES. And we have brought with us a lot of copies of the latest edition of the Foreign Service Journal, which is focused on November 1989 and the fall of the wall, and has about 30 essays, firsthand stories of that period, and one of them is mine, so I'm flogging it. But no, seriously, it's a good read, and for a lot of us who were either witnesses or working it from here in Washington, it's a moving and in some ways depressing read, but I do recommend it to you. So I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I'm president of the American Foreign Service Association on detail from the State Department. I wanted to take a look at my experience over 3.5 years in Bulgaria as ambassador to basically come up with a case study of how we can engage with countries of Central and Eastern Europe under the new realities that we're dealing with. And one comment I would make is programs like CERES are more important than ever, because unfortunately we are losing expertise and we are losing nuance and we're losing understanding. And to deal with a country like Bulgaria, you really have to understand the history and the culture and the politics. And in my 3.5 years there, I'm afraid I came across very few, certainly young people who had that, Americans. So the study of this region is critical, and as we enter some uncharted waters, I would argue it's more critical than ever. And that nuance is really important. Bulgaria was a country I'd been to in the early 90s on temporary duty and had been fascinated by, but I didn't really have a full understanding until I got there full time. And it's obviously true for those of us in the area studies business. Obviously, each country is different, each relationship with the United States is different, and getting that right is really critical. And I spent a lot of time as ambassador in Sofia explaining to American visitors why their preconceptions were wrong and why their cliches were wrong and why their simplifications were wrong. But I didn't really blame them because they had very few sources of real information. So Bulgaria is an interesting case because I think while every country's history is unique and every country's politics unique in relation to its neighbors, it has a different story. And it's illustrative, and I think it's worth looking at as a way of how we deal with Russia in the neighborhood, how we deal with Turkey in the neighborhood, certainly. You know, a lot of what I heard when I first went to Bulgaria, even in the 90s, was just not true. So one of the things that you hear a lot is that Bulgaria is basically Russophilic, and basically they love the Russians and they don't like the West. And nothing could be further from the truth, especially about the latter portion of that argument. You know, this is a country that fundamentally is facing what I would argue is disappointment with its very firm and determined choices towards the West, toward NATO and EU membership. And that is worth looking at as a larger development in the region. Are we losing because the Russians are winning, put simply, or are we losing because we're not investing and we're not trying? And it's obvious to the people on the other side that we're not. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think when I talk about attitudes, one of the things I found was that constant sense of definitely not disillusionment, but worry that the civilizational choices that Bulgarians had made were not going to be rewarded, and then the constant sense of menace from the big countries in the region. Towards Russia, unlike some of the other countries in the region, the word menace would not be generally used, and there is an undercurrent of historical friendship, which is partially based on reality and partially based on historical myth-making that starts in first grade in every Bulgarian school, in which they learn about the Russians liberating them from 500 years of Ottoman slavery. And it's important to note that the word slavery is absolutely required to be used in Bulgaria. There was actually an education minister who proposed changing the textbooks to say Ottoman rule, and she had to step down because you're absolutely not allowed to not call it slavery. And you're not allowed to admit that anything positive happened in 500 years. It's an absolute prohibition. And they just rededicated the Bulgarian cathedral in Istanbul, and the Prime Minister went last year, and it is an absolutely gorgeous marble and gold pile near the Bosporus, built by the Bulgarian community in Istanbul in the 19th century, and it does not look to me like it was built by slaves, let's put it that way. But try to say that in Bulgaria and you're in big trouble. So that narrative is there together with the simplified version of the Russian liberation, which is not entirely untrue, but as even some of the most Russian nationalist-leaning politicians will tell you privately, they know about the massacres of Bulgarian villagers, they know about the suppression of the Macedonian movement, they know about the Russians conniving with the Turks to prevent Bulgaria from actually becoming independent, dividing Bulgaria into two territories, all of those things which most Bulgarians have no idea about. But it's all in the past. But this goes by saying that the traditional cliches are not quite true. What there is, and I think this is a growing phenomenon in some of the other parts of the region, is what I would just refer to very simply as an anti-Russian sentiment. No one wants to send their kids to university in Russia. Nobody wants to go on vacation to Russia. Most Bulgarians have never been to Russia and will never go. But they just don't want to fight with Russia. They don't want to be in conflict with Russia, and they especially don't want trouble with Russia if they're not sure that we have their back. And that's the point that we're confronting right now. So that's, you know, I think a really important point. What Russia is doing now as a case study is illustrative. I think it's probably more active in Bulgaria than in any of the other former Warsaw Pact countries, partly because of ease of access, partly because of I think it's the largest Russian population in the former Warsaw Pact by far, which is concentrated on the coast, not particularly large in Sofia or Plovdiv, but it's big. It's hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom, in my experience, are sort of anti-Putin people who are exiles, basically, and wanted to get out of Russia, and they're not in Bulgaria for any nefarious purposes. And there are a whole lot of mixed marriages and mixed families, especially on the coast in Burgas and Varna, and they're firmly settled there. So I don't like sort of alarmist things about how big the Russian presence is as a potential threat. But nonetheless, it's safe to say that of the hundreds of thousands of Russians in Bulgaria, a certain percentage of them are working for the special services and have a lot of visa of access. And people are still, it's 30 years, but there's still enough relationships going back to intelligence training school and even in the foreign policy community to McGimo and others that their people still know each other, and there's still a generation which is getting to retirement age now that has friendships that are still useful to the Russians. The Russians are more dominant in energy in Bulgaria than they are, I think, anywhere else in the region, and unfortunately, despite some small steps forward, like the construction of the new gas pipeline to Greece that will bring gas from Azerbaijan via TAP and TANAP, it's going to be a very small amount of gas, and this is happening at the same time that they're going ahead with Turkish Stream in parallel to Nord Stream 2. And suffice it to say, from my perspective, after almost 4 years there, we are losing the energy battle. We're losing it on nuclear, we're losing it on gas. And partly because of EU pressure, Bulgaria is probably gradually going to lose its one source of indigenous energy, which is coal. And we have two big American energy companies that have built state-of-the-art, low-emission coal plants to help Bulgaria replace its dangerous nuclear plants. And the EU is probably going to pressure them to shut them down, which means the dependence on Russia will become even greater. So that's a challenge, and it's obviously a challenge in the region as well. It's not specific, but I think Bulgaria, you see it more than ever. The head of the Lukoil office in Sofia was generally referred to as the real Russian ambassador, and in many ways he was, and he was a McGimo graduate and somebody who had extensive ties. Media, the Russians have flooded the media space with not all false news. If it's all false news, it's not credible and nobody pays any attention. You got to do it skillfully and mix in some real stuff with some junk. But they're constantly coming up with stories, and one of the techniques they use is to sort of float them in the phony electronic publications that they've created and then see what gets picked up and refine that. So the example I like to cite from last year is they actually put out a story saying that we were shutting down our presence at Incirlik in Turkey and moving our tactical nukes to Romania. But this story was not released in the Romanian media, the electronic media, only in Bulgaria. Very skillfully done. And the reason, and probably you can confirm this, is if you told Romanians that we were moving our nuclear weapons there, they would be very pleased. So that doesn't work. But if you tell Bulgarians that we're moving our nuclear weapons to Romania, they get nervous. And this is part of the Russian narrative. See what you bought into. You took all that advice to join the West. They'll never really accept you. And meanwhile, what you get is nuclear weapons in your backyard. That's the sort of not so subtle message. And that's the kind of stuff they do all the time. They've had some people try to actually outright buy some publications and, more importantly, TV stations. That hasn't succeeded. Probably one of the best things the Bulgarians did after the end of communism was to ban over-the-air Russian broadcasting. So it is available on cable, but there's no Russian media available over the air. And what that means is for kids in rural Bulgaria, places that don't have cable TV, they get Nickelodeon and they get Cartoon Network, but they don't get Russian TV. And that has an effect. And as a matter of fact, you meet so many Bulgarians with amazing English, even at like the age of 11 or 12, and you say to them, how'd you learn English? And they say, oh, Cartoon Network. So, I mean, that's a success story. But the other thing that's going on as a dynamic that I think is worth flagging is the bromance between Putin and Erdogan is putting it simply freaking out the Bulgarians because they're pretty much sure Russia's not a direct threat, but they're pretty sure Turkey someday is and has been. And then if the Turks and the Russians are getting together and you're Bulgaria, this just can't be good. And so that's a constant undercurrent. Mentioning corruption as an issue, I will say there have been some real areas of progress, and I think giving up the fight on corruption is a mistake, but the progress has mostly been in the micro areas. So things like government services matter, and it's much, much better. And this, I think, is good for democratic societies. So if you need a driver's license or a building permit or something like that, or to register a business, you can do it online now. There's no corruption. There's no chance of somebody hassling you or asking for money, getting a passport. That makes a big difference. But if you get a big grant from the EU, definitely 10% is going to somebody. That's just a given, or 10% may be low. And that has not changed. It has not improved. And that leads to just another critique I have, and I've shared this with my European colleagues. It was a miraculous moment when Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU, and obviously they weren't quite ready, but they were. If they missed that moment, they were probably never going to get in. So I count myself as somebody who thinks it was wonderful, and someday it will eventually come to fruition. But unfortunately, the European Union and the way it's structured, unfortunately, contributes to the corruption in multiple ways. And one of them is the lack of oversight of the massive amounts of grant money. And it's a willful lack of oversight. So what they do is they'll send €1 billion to Bulgaria, and then they'll send a questionnaire about how it's being spent. And then they send a sort of helpful study guide. It's like Cliff Notes. And they say, here's what your answers should look like. And then they send back the answers they're supposed to send back, and everybody in Brussels is happy because they don't have to get on the plane and actually come look at the projects. And plus, they have a long weekend coming, and if they can take off early on Friday, and it's so helpful to have the Bulgarians just filling the questionnaires out the way they're supposed to. And this is not Bulgaria, obviously, this is Romania, this is all of them, Slovakia. This is not unique, but I just saw this up close. The second thing is every project comes with media money, and there's a publicity budget for every EU project. And since all the countries are sovereign and equal, the only thing that can happen is the media budget is given to the government in question to spend as it wishes. And guess what? They spend it to favor their friends and punish their enemies. And there is no possibility of Brussels having a say on how the money is spent because, of course, all the governments are sovereign and equal, including the new members, which is true, but this ends up furthering, and in Bulgaria it's blatant, furthering the publications and media outlets that favor the people in power. So that's something I think we've discussed, and that the fundamental EU model doesn't really work, and it went from being very almost colonial before accession, with checklists and requirements and all of a sudden, especially with the financial crisis and Brexit and the Greek crisis and the global financial meltdown, basically the message was, you're in, we're going to send you lots of money, and someday we'll come back and check on you, but right now, enjoy the money and welcome, we're glad to have you. And it's not helping in a lot of ways, and the compliance and verification mechanism that was put in place is not serious and is actually winding down now. As I said, there is progress on some aspects of the corruption, but the big stuff is as bad as ever, and the EU is not helping. Just a word on NATO, and this is true again across the region, but Bulgaria is a country that doesn't have a plan B and has put all its eggs in one basket, partly because it was conviction, they really believed in it, but partly because they didn't have another basket to choose from. And when they see NATO looking shaky, just like when they see Brexit and the EU looking shaky, there's a lot of nervousness that plays into the Russian narrative. And the Russian narrative is, you made your choice, you chose wrong, and now you're going to pay. And remember, they're not going to be here in a few years, but we're going to be here forever. And it's not entirely effective. Sometimes the threats make people angry and turn them the other way. But the NATO situation, I think, is something that they're feeling very acutely. The other thing is just in terms of military modernization, this is another example where the Russians are hitting it very hard. Bulgaria, like Romania, has chosen now to spend significant resources on military modernization, finally buying modern NATO-compatible equipment and replacing the Soviet-era equipment. And the Russian line on this is, so you've chosen not to have teachers and not to have police and not to have hospitals, and instead you're giving money to Lockheed Martin, and that's what your overlords have imposed on you. And by the way, they're not helping you buy the equipment, are they? And that's another sore point. We do have Prime Minister Borisov coming to the White House next week, which is a good thing. I think in part because they went ahead with the F-16 purchase. But it's kind of shocking, and I felt this way as ambassador and made my views known, that we really didn't help with that purchase at all. We helped, there's $1.2 billion, and we contributed about $135 million, and they paid cash. And when asked, why don't we help our allies buy American military equipment, the answer is we stopped doing that after Poland. And if the question is then, well, why is that? The answer is because that's what we decided. What the Bulgarians ask, and the Romanians who spent a lot more money, is how come you're giving money to help Egypt and the Philippines and Indonesia and even India buy American military hardware and not your allies? And I think that's a subject that should be revisited. It was a bipartisan decision in the last decade, but in a place like Bulgaria, it hurts us, and the Russians play very heavily on that. So just to wrap up, I think what you see in Bulgaria is in some ways a great success story if you step back and look at where they were even 15 years ago, the beginning of the 2000s, and where they are now. They've got an amazing introduction of freedom. It's the first generation in Bulgarian history that's free to travel and work and study wherever they want in Europe, freedoms that actually we Americans don't have. And overall, the social indicators, the quality of life indices are better. They've got growth, they've got a balanced budget, but the demographic challenge, as with Romania and other countries, is very, very serious. And I would say, in my capacity as a former ambassador to Bulgaria, we're not paying enough attention to Bulgaria or the region. We're not investing enough resources. And this is working to the Russians' advantage. And I would argue against drawing lines in the sand and then not backing them up. So my feeling about Turkish Stream and Nord Stream 2 is we shouldn't have opposed them if we weren't going to win. And that also has helped the Russians, I think, to some extent. That said, overall, having started working in the region in the 80s, I remain fundamentally optimistic. And to see a country like Bulgaria be truly free and open and so different from what I first saw in Sofia in the late 80s leaves me optimistic. But we've got a lot of challenges, and especially the Russian angle. This is not a time when I think we're doing all the things we need to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Rubin. Our other panelists, I think we've had 3 really thought-provoking talks, and I think I will restrain my desire to ask a lot of questions and let the audience have the first go at the panelists. And I see a hand in the back. Hang on a second, I think some mic coming your way.
Hi there. My name is Dia. I'm an associate of Davis Center, which is a rival institution, and has celebrated its 60th anniversary this year as well. My question is for Paula. You mentioned you did an empirical research in Eastern Europe on populism, and populism seems to have, common features on both sides of the Atlantic. The urban versus rural cleavage seems to be the most important one. Xenophobia plays a role. But if you look at, say, the Pew research that recently came out on Eastern Europe, it says that the countries of Central Europe are the most satisfied with the transition of the last 30 years, right? So you didn't have the dramatic deindustrialization that this country has experienced in the 1980s and the 1990s, right? Which directly fueled populism in the United States. On the other hand, you didn't have the Russian disinformation as a contributing factor, because Fidesz wins elections in Hungary in early 2010s, right? And its strongest opposition in Hungary is, in fact, a party that is even further to the right, right? And so what do you attribute populism to in Eastern Europe? That is my question. If it's not the economic factors, if it's not the deindustrialization, as you saw in the United States, if it's not xenophobia, because those are very homogeneous societies, and the populists come to power there before 2015, which is the key year for the migration crisis, and if it's not Russian propaganda, those are three major factors, right? What is it? What do you attribute the rise of populism in Central and Eastern Europe to? Thank you.
Oh, should I respond?
A small question, Paula. We'll see if you can.
Excellent. So actually, of the three possible factors you mentioned that you say that didn't contribute to the rise of populism in Eastern Europe, I would actually challenge two of them. So the dramatic deindustrialization that happened in the US, actually similar processes took place in Eastern Europe. With the transition process, a lot of plants that used to work in Eastern Europe were pretty much shut down, and a lot of economic activity pretty much ceased. So there are important, like, large regions in Eastern Europe where traditional economic activity no longer is no longer structured along the lines that it was in 1995. So a lot of changes in the economic realm took place, which is one of the reasons why you saw such a huge exodus of people from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, because they didn't have jobs back home. Mining, I don't even know if it still works. For example, in Romania, it's completely almost shut down, even though it used to be one of the biggest sectors. So on that end, I would say the economic challenges were quite dramatic in Eastern Europe on the industry side. Xenophobia, I would also say that that also played into the election of populist leaders, especially since the most clear examples, both in Hungary and Poland, the leaders campaigned on very traditional values, political campaigns, so keep the country pure, keep immigrants out, keep Muslims out, so that definitely played a factor. On the Russian disinformation, I do agree with you. At the time of Orban's election, and I'm not sure about the more recent elections in Poland, if at the time, I don't think. I just think at the time in Hungary, Orban did win fair and square because of previous scandals within the Hungarian political system. So I would say that of the three, two of those factors actually did play a role in Eastern Europe. The economic factor as well as the anti-immigrant elements definitely helped these populist leaders win.
Great. Other questions? David.
Lyndon, I want to ask you, first of all, fascinating presentation on the frozen conflicts. I'm glad you drew attention to some of the real local issues that we often neglect, especially those of us who have spent time from a negotiator's standpoint trying to resolve these conflicts. We think oftentimes leave that in our rear view mirror. But I'm wondering if you can talk about these conflicts a bit as a manifestation of Russian foreign policy objectives. I think each one of them certainly is, perhaps for different reasons, although I think there are some overarching themes. But I'd welcome your view on that, especially having sat in Moldova as OSCE rep, your views on that, and Eric, no doubt, has views on this as well. So,
I think that those goals have evolved over time, and I think in the 90s they were. You could distinguish between the Georgian breakaways and Transnistria much more easily. And in Transnistria was about, at least from the public, to be clear, a lot of it is always been about geopolitics and PIECE keeping, right? So that's fine. But I'm glad not all of you had heard that one before, but that's another classic. So there, I'm here all week. It's evolved over time, as also with Russia's changing fortunes. You know, sometimes the message to these places will be, hey, belt tightening time. You got to take care of yourselves. We're not going to be the sugar daddy anymore. But then it'll swing back. I think now, if we think about what is the situation right now, that article about Madagascar, I think it was, which was mentioned, it goes through the toolkit pretty well. But the key part is that people do this for fun and profit, right? I mean, some of the individuals and entities involved are sort of semi-state linked. Remember the guy who was the only hard, actual, heavily armed person and group of people in eastern Ukraine at the outset, as far as I know, was a war reenactor, right? Kind of a, yeah, right, or Mr. Strelkov, Igor Ivanovich, who he had at the very beginning a number of mercenaries with him who had been in Crimea and perhaps elsewhere, but it was a small group of people. So what that shows us is, and at that point, those folks being there, Russia had deniability about it. Right? What happened later, not so much. But I think the goals. So I'm being vague, but I think the goals really. I don't like the word hybrid because I think it's been used and abused, but it's a wide range of things. So some of it is push back against the West. I have a lovely fridge magnet that I bought in Tiraspol that has a photo of a very laughing Putin, and it says, "Расскажи мне еще про санкции," right? Tell me again about sanctions, right? Probably they sell that in Moscow too, but in Transnistria and in some of these other places, people very much like also to tweak the West. And so the values stuff and the culture war things, as Russia has kind of re-emerged, that's become a bigger component of things. Abkhazia is a bit sui generis. I mean, they're all sui generis, but Abkhazia has a specific component of now the Russians have really made it a hardened Russian base, but the actual Abkhaz, who were the original reason for the conflict, are not really happy about giving sort of everything up to the Russians. And actually, if you look at the local news, there have been some interesting things, including an employee of the local Russian consulate getting shot on the beach over a real estate dispute because there's nice beachfront property there. Why was Mayor Luzhkov always interested in Abkhazia? Well, because the city of Moscow had a sanatorium there historically, and people like to go vacation there. So the reasons can be pretty esoteric. However, if the interest is taken by influential members of the Russian elite, Alisher Usmanov was a shareholder of the Moldovan metallurgical factory for some period of time. Petro Poroshenko was supposedly a minority shareholder of that same factory for some period of time. So it's kind of there's that Simpsons quote about it all being a rich tapestry. It's really more of a kind of a finger painting mess sometimes, but it can also be viewed as a tapestry. And there's a lot of things going on. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I mean the question that people also might ask about these places is, why should we care, right? Who cares? And the answer is probably obvious to many people in this room, but these breakaway entities undermine the sovereigns. In a number of cases, these are countries with whom we wish to have good relationships. I think it cannot be overstated the degree to which, particularly in a place like Moldova, where there is kind of a lot of interaction with Transnistria, and I think that this is also true in Donbass. I'll know a little bit less about that, and perhaps to some extent in the Georgian breakaways. It was earlier, certainly, until Saakashvili shut down the market in South Ossetia. But the amount of corruption that these places throw off, the ability to just kind of conjure money out of thin air. I mean, in Transnistria, when you start asking about, well, how does the smuggling stuff work? Sometimes it's traditional smuggling, physical moving of goods across borders without paying tariffs, whatever. But sometimes it's really creative stuff, like when you have the ability to put export VAT on the books in Ukraine and then get a refund, but there was nothing actually exported. And so that's literally conjuring money out of thin air. So if you can do that, then you can use that cash also for influence operations. And guess what? That cash can come to this town and buy influence. So to me, that's why we should continue to be interested in these places, because they throw off a lot of not so good things. And you know, my presentation did focus on some of the nice things, maybe, or the actual qualities of the places and the people who live there, because yeah, in my work I encounter those people and I feel for them. You know, they're in a tough situation, and in some cases, I mean, if you consider the plight, for example, of a police officer in the town of Horlivka or Kramatorsk, who, I can't remember which of those two towns, but in one of those two towns, we heard tell that, you know, several days after the masked guys took over, they had the police had their daily lineup, and one of the guys said, no, I'd like to keep the Ukrainian flag on my uniform. Well, they shot him in front of all of his colleagues. So what are you going to do? Then are all of those people terrorists, separatists? No, in many cases, they're just folks who, hey, I got to live here, I got a family, I got nowhere to go. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that can be said about these places. It's complicated, and you can look at it on multiple layers.
Thanks. And I just add, I agree with everything Linda said, but I think very importantly, we need to not simply group the frozen conflicts together. And I would say, I mean, you half-jokingly referred to Transnistria as the easiest. And I think it is only because it's the only one where some progress has been made, thanks to your efforts and the efforts of the colleagues at OSCE mission and the negotiators on 5+2, that actually, you know, has really affected people's lives in a positive way, in a small way, but in a positive way. But I would separate out Eastern Ukraine and Nagorno-Karabakh as two conflicts that are just simply dangerous. One of them is currently bloody. The other could turn bloody very quickly, as we all know, having worked on all these negotiations. The one that scares me is Nagorno-Karabakh, and I'm looking at David. But, you know, and only because there is an international engagement, I think, have we avoided something much worse. And the Russians, I think, are happy either way. You know, the current situation is fine and gives them influence, but a war could have utility to them as well. I hate to be cynical about it, but I think so. So I would just differentiate. Crimea is a whole different category, and I think there's increasingly consensus. We have to hold the line hard like we did with the Baltic states after World War II, but at the same time, nothing's going to change anytime soon. That's just a given. But stopping the war in the Donbass and preventing war in NK, I think, really have to be the two top priorities.
Nick? Yeah. Oh, can we have one quick question? Nick.
Hi there, I'm Nick Kulaviak. I'm a current CERES student. This goes to anyone, but probably Mr. Allen specifically. I'm in the Ambassador Yalowitz's conflict resolution class, and you were in a couple weeks ago, and we talked about the then current government in Moldova and kind of ideas about the future and where that might go. And this week obviously has had some diversions from things we talked about then. So I'm wondering what you see as the next kind of logical steps. From what I understand, there's a technocratic government that's currently been approved by the parliament, but I don't know, where do you see this going, and how does it potentially impact Transnistria?
The AP Wire reports are generally not good at capturing the subtleties of these things, and so the New York Times ran one that did talk about a technocratic government, which is how it's positioning itself, and I guess time will tell. You know, one of the things that was rumored or written in some speculative analytical publications to have been a factor in the government falling, actually, was the decision of some of the members of Maya Sandu's government to, from time to time, and I didn't follow this closely, so I may get details wrong, freeze the bank accounts of certain Transnistrian large enterprises. So there were a lot of reasons that the government fell, and in fact, it wasn't entirely unexpected that happened. What that might mean for the Transnistrian settlement process is a very interesting question, because if you now have a government that makes the Russians feel comfortable, and that will, you know, be more cooperative with the Russians in the negotiation process, then maybe there could be room for some things that people would call progress, but that other people would say, you know, these are concessions. I think it's really wait and see about that new government, and I try not to make predictions in particular about Moldovan politics, but it may be the case. I mean, look, the other thing that I found to be very interesting and unexpected this week was the interview by Kolomoisky where he said, oh, Ukraine should do an about-face and turn around towards Russia. Whoa. And then some of those intercepts that came out actually very interestingly portrayed Kolomoisky as being stridently anti-Russian in 2014 and kind of Akhmetov the other way. So I sort of, you know, you can fall victim to the conspiracy theory thinking that plagues this region. But I'm not sure what may happen in the next 6 months with these places. I definitely agree with what Eric said, and I think it is, of course, a misnomer to call the Donbass a frozen conflict. It is not frozen. It's an active conflict. People die every day. So just to be crystal clear about that. Thanks.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. This was also a fascinating panel. So I know it's been a long day and everyone is looking forward to partying at Marivana, but I hope you will stay a little longer. I first of all want to recognize Diana Arsenian from the Carnegie Corporation. Carnegie has very generously been supporting CERES for a number of years, and in particular, and this goes back to something that Eric was talking about when he said that he's concerned about the next generation of experts, of people who will understand this region. One of the things that Carnegie supported us in doing was to look into compare and look into the various MA programs in Russian and Eurasian studies and see, you know, how they were developing and what the concerns of both the directors and the students were. And so I just want to present briefly the results of this survey. Andy Cutchins, when he was at CERES, he's now in Bishkek as the head of the American University in Central Asia, but he undertook the study with the help of Jesse Mitchell, who was one of our CERES graduates last year, looking into the field, understanding where we are today, and thinking about, you know, how we can secure the future for these programs. And this was partly a result of a survey that was done in 2015 by ACES, which is our professional organization, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And they did a thoroughgoing study. They looked at, I think, 37 PhD programs. And so they were mainly looking at the PhD programs, because obviously, if these programs are going to last, we need to have faculty members who have the PhDs in this area who can teach the MA students and, of course, the PhD students too. And the report came up with a number of conclusions, one of which was that the field of Russian studies in the social sciences was facing, quote, a crisis, an unmistakable decline in interest and numbers in terms of both faculty and graduate students. And then the second conclusion of that report was the dramatic decrease in funding from both the government, federal and state and private foundations raises concerns that the United States will not have enough trained experts in the field in the future. Again, what Ambassador Rubin was talking about. Now, the study also said MA programs are very important. This is where we all come in. They sustain the demand for graduate level courses on Russia in social sciences that probably would not be taught otherwise because there are too few PhD students who would want to take them. In other words, the demand to have a faculty member teach, particularly in a political science department, more so, I would say, than history, because I think that field still values area studies. But particularly in political science, you have the faculty because the MA students, the numbers are there that need the faculty. So what we did, what CERES did then with our Carnegie grant, was we surveyed basically 8 of the major programs that have MAs in Russian and Eurasian studies. And then also Fletcher, we surveyed Fletcher too, but Fletcher's only had its program going for 1 year, so it had limited data. And what we found, certainly from, and we surveyed the directors of the programs and then also students anonymously were given these surveys and they could choose to fill them in or not, but many of them did. And so the major concerns, again, of the directors certainly were the decrease in funding for MA programs, especially government funding. And you may know that in 2014, the Obama administration cut funding for Title VI programs, and particularly for Russian and Eurasian studies in 2014, right, when you have a war going on in Ukraine, by 40%. And so that has meant, obviously, some centers have actually closed. Other centers don't have that kind of support anymore. And then the second big problem that all the directors agreed on, that political science no longer values area studies. Paula, you're one of the few examples of someone who did an MA in CERES. You did a PhD in the government department, and you are hopefully going to get a job as a professor. You're certainly active in the field, and you will carry this tradition on. But certainly the Georgetown government department rarely admits students anymore that have any area interest, because the students themselves know this is not the way to get jobs at American universities in political science, because they're not interested in people, imagine that, who understand the language, the history, and the culture of a region. And obviously, as someone who came up through the area studies programs and has focused on this all of my professional career, I find that astonishing and also very depressing, but that's the way that it's going now. So the question really is, who's going to train the next generation of students in this field? That's a serious consideration. The other thing that most of the directors agreed on was that whereas the numbers of applicants for these programs are more or less steady, they have been declining a little in the last few years. And in fact, all of the AFSIA schools, which are all of the schools that deal with international relations and area studies programs, they've all seen declines in application. This may be a secular trend. Maybe everyone's going to law school, but I think we have a glut of lawyers too. So that's definitely gone down. But the good news, right, there are a lot of enthusiastic students still who love the area, who want to go there, who want to learn the languages, who want to write about it. And so the demand is still there, even if the demand isn't as high as it used to be. And for many of the students, and particularly the CERES graduates, you have found jobs in your field. Not all of you are working in the field, but many of you are. So that's also very good news. I would say the other thing that emerges from this, and that we at CERES certainly understand, is that, of course, the field has to adapt to the changing needs of the market. And so our program has changed over the years. We now focus more on some of the pre-professional training that students need, graduates need, in order to get good jobs. Internships, we've actually reduced the number of courses you have to take. So those of you who graduated in earlier times, students take fewer courses now, but we stress much more, again, having internships, and there are many of them in this town, that prepare them for the work world. So I don't want to take too much time giving you the details of this, but I would say that there's one other thing that came through in all the responses from the 8 schools that we surveyed, and that was the impact of declining U.S.-Russian relations on the programs. Now, on the one hand, that sometimes stimulates demand. I don't know, in the year after Donald Trump was elected, I had record numbers of students in my Russian foreign policy class, but I suspect that had something to do with his election in terms of Russia. But in general, you would have thought that the decline in U.S.-Russian relations would have stimulated at least the U.S. government in understanding we need to put more resources in these areas. But it hasn't actually worked that way. And of course, the decline in relations and the imposition of all these sanctions has meant that the opportunities, at least in the private sector, for our graduates are not what one would have hoped they would have been. And I would add, actually, in the past couple of years, what's happening in the State Department has also acted somewhat as a deterrent to some of our students when they think about what they want to do in their future careers. Hopefully, this will pass. We're obviously very aware of it today with all the testimony and everything. So these are the factors, things that have to do with our own domestic situation and with the decline in U.S.-Russian relations have also, I would say, adversely affected the field. I think a number of the directors of programs also were worried about whether the universities, their universities would remain committed to these programs. And I think that is a serious concern as universities change. They think about new fields of endeavor, and they maybe neglect the ones where they, that are very important and where they've had very good results. So that is a concern. And also the fact that most of us, I think all of us who were surveyed in our research, we don't really have any impact on hiring decisions in departments. Those decisions are taken by other people, and therefore we're sort of out there, but we have little influence over them. Another couple of interesting statistics: the average age for students entering these programs has fallen in the last few years. It certainly has at Georgetown and in most places. Oh yeah, this is a nice little tidbit here. In terms of gender balance, Harvard, Columbia, and Georgetown have more women than men in their programs. Yale, Indiana, and Madison have more men. I don't know how we explain that, but I thought that was a very interesting tidbit there. I think the other thing that came through in the surveys was that Georgetown and sort of Harvard, Fletcher, and Columbia, we're all lucky because we can rely on adjuncts to fill in for us, and we have some wonderful examples of our adjuncts here who teach very important courses for us where we wouldn't have a full-time person in the university, but because of the location, these adjuncts are there. So, and other programs that aren't similarly located cannot rely on adjuncts, and therefore they have to rely on the full-time faculty, and there often aren't full-time faculty in all of the different aspects of the discipline that we teach. More and more universities were also, these programs are relying on private funding for tuition scholarships to support students as the universities themselves rethink their commitment to these programs. And then everyone, as I say, is very concerned about the future of government support. In terms of the students, most of the students that were surveyed in all the programs seem to be pretty happy. A great deal of satisfaction with their programs, not too many complaints. They were asked, how did you choose a particular program? It often had to do with funding, sometimes it had to do with location, sometimes with the offering. But the students themselves came back really pretty positive and hoping that they would certainly be able to pursue careers in this subject. So we are going to put this on our website. We're going to publish the results of the survey on our website. Some of the universities want to somewhat massage some of the figures they gave us, but it will be up on the website soon. And so I think what we got was a mixed picture here. In terms of Georgetown, I think it's true of the other programs, obviously in the communist era, when we had the RASP program that some of you graduated from, we had a much bigger program. But that was because there was, the government, the US government particularly, gave much more money and sent more people to study here because they believed that, they needed to train more people. But the numbers have certainly evened out, and they're quite steady now. But I think everyone would agree that the future of these programs is uncertain. It partly depends on the vagaries of international politics. It partly depends, again, on government funding, or in the absence of government funding, private funding for it. And so I think everyone agrees to having predictability in funding. I think that will be one of the key determinants of whether we'll be producing new generations of experts in this field. And I'm sure that, at the 70th anniversary of CERES, it will be interesting to see how this has developed in the next decade, because I think we're at a point now where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think the other thing that came out in the survey is also generational change. And that is that a number of departments, political science departments, are not replacing people when they retire with people in the field. Professor Balzer, when he retired, was not replaced by someone with an expertise in this area. And so that's something that all of the directors of these programs were very concerned about. That's sort of a little view into the future here. Before I close, I want to thank Wesson Radomski, our Director of Academic Programs. You want to stand up for your help? And Minatola Al-Abeidi for all your great work in organizing the conference. Thank you. So, we will see you in a little while, and thank you all for coming, and thank you also those of you when you get the Christmas letter from us asking for support, who give us some support. I can't end without saying that.